the Masculinity Unmasked Podcast with hosts Max Wilson and Greg Stein.
Okay, hello and welcome everyone to another episode of Masculinity Unmasked, the fortnightly conversation that delves deep into what it means to be a man in the 21st century. So the topic of conversation for today's episode is rewriting your story, healing attachment wounds and trauma. Unfortunately, my co-host and fellow coach Greg Stein is unable to make this evening as he was at the London Marathon, so he'll be missed. But we're very lucky to have with us tonight a really interesting guest and a very close friend of mine, Aliyah Ali, who is a somatic trauma-informed coach and breathwork practitioner, as well as a childhood trauma specialist. So welcome to the show, Aliyah, and thanks very much for joining us this evening. Do you want to start by sharing a little bit about yourself and the sort of work that you do with our listeners?
Yes, hello. Thank you for inviting me onto your show. It's a real great theme. Much needed. So as you've already explained, I started off as a coach, and then I moved into wanting to work with the body and the nervous system. So from breath work, it then became more intrigue into trauma, and that's really where my speciality is. And I really believe that in order to kind of create that lasting change in whatever it might be, our behaviors, our patterns, our relationships, we need to not just understand the mental patterns. We need to also align that with the body, because as we know, the body keeps the score, and that trauma and suppressed emotion really does get stuck energetically in our nervous system and our body and fires off with our mind, where all those limiting beliefs live. And so kind of like I really believe in aligning the two, and that's kind of how I've evolved into now somatic trauma therapy, and very much working with the experiences, which we'll talk about in a bit, that we have all kind of had to some degrees or another from childhood, and have affected us in our adult life and relationships. And I do this work because that's what's pretty much got me to where I am now in my life, finally feeling like the most authentic version of myself ever at age almost 36, and finally having experienced the most wonderful and healthy, secure relationship that I've ever had, and just being at a place where I am ready and willing and to continue to do the work on myself, but also teach what I know and help others in the way that I've been helped and have helped myself. So yeah, that's kind of why I'm here and do this work.
And that's a real testament to the work, right? And that's I think a journey a lot of practitioners have been on. They've done the work themselves that they now offer to other people, and that's so great to hear that that's been your experience as well. You talked a lot about trauma there. For the benefit of the listeners, what actually do we mean by trauma? What are we talking about?
Yeah, it's a good question. It can be confusing as well. I was confused about it when I first started learning about trauma years ago. There's so many ways to explain it. Many people know Gabor Mate, and I really like how he explains it. It's not about the event or the experience itself. It's about what happened in the body at the time of that event. And this really captures the essence of what we're talking about today, because the memory is there in the mind, but and the experience is kind of there to a point. Sometimes we have conscious memory of it, sometimes we don't, but really it's the body that remembers how it felt at the time. So that is the bit that either got resolved or didn't get resolved from childhood, and that's what the trauma is. It's like stuck survival energy that was mobilized in response to a threat, i.e., in this context, usually when a child didn't feel safe or didn't get put back into safety quick enough or well enough or at all. And that creates this kind of response, fight or flight, right? And if that didn't get completed, it becomes stuck energy in the body, the muscles, the fascia, the nervous system. And this is what trauma is. It's really stuck energy over decades. And we also know of freeze, freeze is often happening as a result of being in this overactive fight and flight response that didn't get completed. So the body is clever, right? It shuts down, and that's what the freeze is. It's like when the animal plays dead, that's what that is. And it kind of suppresses even more that stuck survival energy.
Yeah.
And if a child is overwhelmed as well, it can also just go straight into a freeze. Again, it's a protection response. But if the child is not put back into safety and made to feel okay again in its environment, this becomes the trauma that gets stuck in our body. And this is the trigger points in our adult life for various behaviors that we learn, relationship patterns, emotional reactions that happen. So, yeah.
Yeah, and I love that description of it as energy that's stuck in the body, because that's it shows the power of the somatic work, which we'll talk about a bit later on, about releasing some of that. But I've heard the distinction between big T and small T, big trauma, small trauma, and the way I understand that is sort of the big stuff is the sort of life-threatening events, deeply terrifying events, and then the small trauma is those sort of cumulative events that deeply impact our emotional world. Is that a fair distinction between the two?
That's a very good way of explaining it. Yeah, exactly that. Big T is it can be anything from really devastating events like natural disasters and wars, but also in this context, like developmental trauma, which is like the real early years, from even in utero to birth trauma to in the early years of development. There was like some serious, severe neglect or abuse, that kind of thing. Small T trauma is the kind of subtle, chronic, everyday experiences where our emotional needs were not met well enough, good enough, or at all. And really the key words for small T trauma is if there was inconsistent, unpredictable, kind of unreliable emotional availability and emotional attunement to the child's needs. And this can happen in most of our experiences, just to different degrees. And that's the kind of interesting topic of conversation, I guess.
Yeah, really interesting. And it's terms that some of us may have heard of, but I imagine a lot of the listeners aren't familiar with. And linked to that are these terms of attachment wound, attachment style, right? So could you explain, for the benefit of the listeners, what we mean by attachment wound and attachment styles?
Yeah, we're hearing more and more about this now. Attachment wound. So trauma, another way to understand trauma is it means wound in Greek. So that stuck energy in the nervous system and body is like creating a little wound in there. That's the trigger point, right? So that's a helpful way to understand it, right? It's a trauma wound caused by the attachment between caregiver or parent and child. And that's the best way to really know it. It's basically a relational trauma between parent, caregiver, and child at the early years, and then throughout adolescence and even into our adulthood. I'm sure many of us can say they have, maybe a parent, not everybody, of course, but a parent that maybe they have a difficult relationship with still in adulthood. And this is still a product of attachment wound and relational trauma. But yeah, so attachment wounds are essentially these traumas caused by the relationship between child and caregiver. And if there was basically inconsistent, unpredictable emotional attunement to, say, needs of feeling seen, being heard, being free to express your feelings without being shut down or punished or criticized or shamed, or just a parent not being there enough. They might have been there sometimes, but not all the time because of work or illness or other kind of emotional struggles they may have been having. Again, through no fault of a parent, this stuff happens, right? Emotional and emotional availability, how present they were. And the other one that really we can connect with attachment wound is this concept of rupture and repair. And this people may resonate more with. This is all about there being no such thing as perfect, and there's no such thing as a perfect parent. And there is always inevitably going to be a rupture between a relationship. There's going to be a disagreement. There's going to be a parent may have a stressful day. They may have not. They may have scared the child and yelled at the child. They may have just, had a bad reaction one day. So many examples, right? But it's all about how consistently, how good enough they've repaired that rupture quickly. And I keep using the word consistently, but it really is that consistently repairing. So that, for example, if a parent yelled at their child, that's okay to a point, but how quickly did they then say, it's okay, I'm sorry, I just was having a bad day, this was not your fault. So that child never then developed a sense of wrongness about them and belief that they did something wrong. So that's what attachment wounds
That's
are.
really interesting, yeah. That the speed in which or the correction measure that's used, how powerful that can be as a parent. And I think putting it on the table as well, we're not talking about pointing fingers. Some people don't get on with their parents, and that's fine. But a lot of people have a good relationship but still need to do the inner work to heal some of these wounds. And we're not necessarily talking about blaming, are we? We're talking about,
Absolutely.
like you say, perfection doesn't exist, but it's about identifying what those wounds may be for us.
Yes, and that is part of the healing and resolution work in ourselves to come to terms with what wasn't good enough without blaming the parent, because that means we can start to stop the self-shaming, if there is any of that, stop the negative self-talk, stop the self-abandonment, basically, by just seeing that actually there was a failure or a lack of something in my environment growing up or in my relationship with my parent, but it's okay. I can now go and reparent myself, and find out what it is that I needed that I didn't get enough of. And then that's the kind of beautiful healing growth journey.
Yeah, and we'll touch on that because that's part and parcel of the work that you do. I'm just curious about the attachment style then. So we talked quite in depth about the wound, which is really interesting, but what about the attachment styles? There's different types, I think, isn't there?
Yeah, so there's 4 that are known. There's secure, which is what we all want to be. But we can all earn that. That's the beautiful part of this work. We can all innately heal our bodies and minds and move into a secure attachment. But the ones that most people probably know more about are anxious attached, which I am and have been earning secure attachment slowly. And that's why I do this work, because I very much resonate with anxious attachment. There is avoidant attached, which is kind of on the opposite side of that coin. And then there's the disorganized attachment, which is the kind of more complicated and more challenging attachment style.
Okay. And if listeners are thinking, okay, where might I fall? What's the difference between anxious, avoidant, and disorganized?
Yeah. So a really quick way to distinguish them is anxious attached is basically the underlying fear of an anxious attach is fear of abandonment, and fear of being alone. So this is why they end up sometimes being seen as needy. I don't like that word, but it's simply because they didn't get their needs met, or they put their parents' needs above theirs, or they had to work hard to feel like they were good enough or lovable. Maybe because there was a controlling parent, or there was punishing, or there was just inconsistency in being seen, or a parent was there sometimes and not there sometimes. So it kind of learned to work for the love. So they kind of are known for that kind of work, doing above and beyond to maintain that kind of relationship. which we'll probably move into in a bit about the people pleasing side. But there's anxious, which is very much about the fear of abandonment, and avoidant is more fear of dependency on anybody. But
Okay.
really underneath that is a fear of rejection and abandonment, but it gets suppressed. That fear gets suppressed. And instead it becomes, well, actually, no, I can't trust anyone and rely on anyone, so I'll do it alone. Because if I do trust anyone or rely too heavily, I'll get hurt or neglected or shamed. So they very much are about fear of depending on anybody. And then disorganized is really the two meshed together. They have an intense fear of abandonment, and a desire for closeness, but they also at the same time have an intense fear of dependency. And that's often because they would have experienced a bit more of severe unpredictability and chaos in their environment growing up, where the source of safety and love was also the source of fear and hurt. So this could be like a very scary parent was also very loving as well. This kind of example. So that's why it's kind of disorganized and a bit confusing in terms of what they want and what they don't want.
Yeah, that's really, really useful explanations. I was thinking of myself personally, where I might fall there as well, and it is really interesting. One thing you said there is around anxious attachment. You talked about people pleasing behaviors. That's something I can certainly relate to, and you used the term adaptive behavior as you were talking about that, and certainly that's something we discussed before you came on. So, what do you mean by adaptive behaviors? What are some examples of adaptive behaviors? Where do they come from?
Yes, so adaptive behaviors is one terminology for basically a learnt behavior or a survival mechanism. So as children, we survive. And the most important thing is to protect our attachment, i.e., with our parents. So regardless of if we didn't get, like, if our needs weren't met or there was something bad going on, we still, out of survival, protect that attachment. And in order to do that, so our needs can get suppressed, our feelings can get suppressed, our sense of self can get suppressed. And this is when we adapt. Adaptions happen to cope, basically. And we adapt into these certain behavioral traits that take us away from our real self, our real, true, authentic self. And that's, people pleasing is known as an adaptive behavior.
Yeah. That's fascinating. And I'm just thinking of it in the context of obviously the podcast, Masculinity Unmasked, how men in particular might be affected by adaptive behaviors and how that might play out in the workplace, in their personal lives. And I'm thinking sort of, things like perfectionism, but also, being that super person, but even you've got to be strong and competent all times.
Yep, they are also adaptive behaviors. Exactly. Perfectionism is known as an adaptive behavior. Being that super person, like super capable at everything, prove. That's a very common adaptive behavior too. As well as the rescuer, fixer role. These are all known as adaptive behaviors, and all of them take us out of our kind of real sense of authenticity and basically are developed because it's our source of worth. Because somewhere along the line we didn't develop a kind of good enough sense of self-worth. So we learnt these behaviors to get some sense of worth, and basically the kind of overarching reason for that is to create safety, because that's the most basic need, is just to feel safe in ourselves, in our environment. And because that may have not happened, we didn't feel safe. We have to create this safety by controlling something. So people pleasing is almost like a kind of control by by thinking about always what the other person needs. It's almost like I'm in control of my environment now, and that gives me a distorted sense of safety. And then I lose all sense of what I need. My sense of self goes out the window. Same with perfectionism, very common one. if this is perfect, then I can prove my worth. I'm capable, I'm lovable, I'm worthy.
Mm.
Very, very linked to that anxious attached style. If I'm not perfect, fear of abandonment. So I have to be perfect, have to be perfect. Same with
Yeah.
avoidant. Avoidants are also known for their perfectionism, but on the other side of, if I'm perfect, then I don't need anybody, because they don't feel like they can trust and rely on anyone, really. So if they are perfect, then that means, or if they are the super person,
Mm.
then they're safe, right? Again, they've created safety in their environment, and it's a kind of way of controlling their environment. Again,
Yeah.
distorted sense of safety. But this is why it's really hard to change these behaviors, because they are survival.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
It's almost like uh, it's almost like the threat of death to the self, right? If you're not repeating these patterns of behavior, that's, I guess, what's going on internally. It's like do or die, really, isn't it? It's like, I love how you
Yeah.
use the term safety to frame it, because it's never really about the thing. Whenever people please is never really actually intrinsically, it's not about the pleasing, and the perfectionism is not really about the work. It's about at the root trying to keep yourself safe. And,
Yes,
and I think you hit the
exactly.
nail on the head there. Um, so,
Hmm.
I can relate to these behaviors. You've talked about your experience, your journey with this. I'm sure most of the listeners can relate in some way, shape, or form to having these adaptive behaviors, to
Hmm.
having these attachment styles. So, what what work do you do with somebody who's wanting to begin to, heal some of these attachment wounds, and work on managing their adaptive um, behaviors?
Um, so obviously, um, lots of different techniques, but I guess just to kind of keep it short and sweet. I usually all of this stuff, trauma essentially disconnects us from our body.
Mm.
And I always like to start with the breath, um, because I feel like it's our most powerful natural medicine to reconnect and anchor us back into our body and find some sense of safety in our body. Because often what happened is that we've lost a sense of safety within us. So we have to create this safety via these different adaptive behaviors. So the breath brings us straight away back inwards, and it directly regulates the nervous system. So that's something I didn't mention, but trauma is basically a severely dysregulated nervous system, or creates massive triggers which dysregulates our nervous system. So the breath is that one way to regulate our nervous system.
Mm.
And then I move into the somatic trauma therapy, because that is basically somatic meaning body. We don't just stay in the mind. We don't just talk about the story and the experience, because, to a point that's helpful, but then we want to also come away from the story, because that in itself can just keep it alive,
Yeah.
um, and repeat the patterns. We need to then move to the somatic healing part. So it's finding the body sensations, finding the nervous system signals, finding the kind of deep, kind of individual feelings going on in the body, i.e., this is where the trauma is, that are connected with that story, connected with that experience, and
Mm.
sit with those feelings or suppressed emotions. And it's energetic, so you really start to feel it energetically, and it's
Mm.
finding out, what do I need? So it's basically reparenting. So what did I not get when I was a child? What did I not get enough of? And how do we give that back to ourselves? And it really, I believe, starts with the body. And then once we've attuned to our needs and our emotions in our body, for example, just sitting with that emotion, as uncomfortable as it can be, we can actually feel the energy discharge. Because as I was saying, trauma is stuck energy. We need to
Yeah.
offer it safe ways to discharge, to allow the life energy, which is your true, authentic self, to start to flow freely.
Mm.
And that takes time, that gentle work. That's why you have to do it very gently, reconnecting very gently to these different individual sensations, or
Mm.
parts, as we call them. For example, that's the inner child work I do as well, which is where we work with the different parts of the child. So, like the scared child, the overwhelmed child, and again, going in and giving them what they need on a somatic level. but then using the rational mind in the way it can be to then change our course of action, create new choices for ourselves, um, creating that conscious awareness now of, oh, this is my impulsive behavior. What's happening in my body? Okay, get to know those feelings in the body, work with them, follow them through, let that energy discharge in some way, and then we can start to find choice again. And we have, the power then of conscious choice.
Yeah. Yeah. Wow. It's as you're talking, I'm just thinking it's so many gems in there, because the head is physically connected to the body, but in society, most of the time, we separate the two, which is really odd. But we are often so disconnected from the body. And if you think about, the fast-paced society we live in, it's drive at all costs, just keep moving forwards, keep pressing forwards, don't listen to your body, keep pressing on this culture of toxic stoicism. And that has disconnected us. So to do the somatic work is a real challenge for a lot of people. But when you start, I can talk from personal experience, once you start that journey of release, it's so powerful, because a lot of this stuff is stored in the body, which is why, a lot of physical conditions manifest from stored trauma, stress, all sorts of things. So I'm just thinking though, so that's sort of the work you do with people, which is amazing. Some people might not be ready for that. Some people might not be ready to walk forwards into therapy or into the coaching space. What would be your advice to them if they just want to dip their toe in the water with this?
Yeah, absolutely. I'd say some gentle journaling around kind of questions about experiences from childhood. So really a compassionate inquiry into what happened, what was happening, but with so much compassion for yourself and so much kind of curiosity as well. That kind of willingness to want to know, well, actually, what did happen? Because I have a lot of clients that say, oh, but I don't understand this because, my parent always said I was amazing and I was beautiful. And then we broke it down and eventually found that actually it was very inconsistent. It wasn't all the time. It was sometimes contingent, sometimes conditional. It doesn't mean they don't love you and don't care and they're amazing parents. They are for most of us. However, there was something that maybe was not enough or consistent enough. And it's kind of going in and asking these questions gently, like, oh, okay, so was I left alone at any periods of time and how long for? Do I remember feeling comforted when I was left alone? When did I feel scared as a child? When did I feel unsafe? Just opening up this curiosity. And also, it's really helpful to get to know how our parents' states were, nervous system states. So, a question like, oh, how was a parent or my parents' nervous system states when growing up? We might start to open up a kind of pathway of like, oh, actually, my parent was super anxious all the time, but I didn't realize as a child, or super stressed. And this can just open up a whole kind of floodgate of self-discovery and understanding, and then through that healing and growth.
Yeah. Without noticing that awareness from going back on your own journey, I guess noticing your own patterns in the present as well, how you're showing up, could be indicative.
And absolutely that becoming a bit more attuned to what do I need. So I also, another question, is like, what do I actually need and how can I start to allow myself to express that? Because this is something we often, a lot of anxious attached struggle with in relationships, at work. And it stems from not knowing our needs and suppressing them often.
Yeah.
So it's coming to learn, like, what do I need? And gently allowing yourself to slowly express it.
Yeah. I love that. And inviting the answers from within, sitting with that. We don't always need to stay in the logic brain with that. And I think one exercise I did once that I now use with clients is as well is jotting down, beginning to think about what actually the beliefs are that you are telling yourself now, and if you were to reframe those, what would those look like? So there can be a rewiring process that happens. I know this is something that we talked about before you came on, but that is some of the work, right? Your brain has neuroplasticity as well. So if we're talking about behaviors and patterns, you can actually change those things. If you think about like a grassy field, you've always walked down one path, you can eventually start to walk down another path, and the grass will grow over on the other one, and then the grass will embed on the new path. So I think getting conscious about, well, how do I want to show up? It comes up back to your question, what is it that I need? And I think there's such power in those words and that exploration.
And they are firing off together. You're right. So that feeling in the body, when we get used to it, is firing off with a limiting belief or a negative thought pattern. So getting to understand that and getting to know that and attending to that in your body, what it needs, movement, somatic release, crying, laughing, hugging, regulation with breath, but also exactly what you said, the reframing of the most common one, right? I'm not good enough.
Yeah.
Which is, again, a learnt belief. It's not true. But therein lies the kind of trigger of all our adaptive behaviors from that. Prove that I'm good enough. So exactly that, learning to gently reframe that with the more possible, kinder, helpful truth about you, and really getting to know, like, what can you be proud of in yourself? Like, where can you prove to yourself, not others, but where can you prove to yourself that actually what you have done today is good enough? What you have achieved so far is good enough. And learning that to learn how to self reassure yourself rather than need to prove or seek it from elsewhere. Like little kind of pockets of evidence of what you did in your day. Like even if it was just go for a walk, where you normally would just keep working. You went for a walk for 5 minutes. That's great. Can you feel proud of it and get to know that feeling and tell yourself that I feel proud of myself? That was really good.
Yeah. It's not really worrying. And there's a great quote that goes something like, the wound is not your fault, but the healing is your responsibility. I think it's Denise Brauman. But
I love that.
That and we're not blaming ourselves, we're not blaming our parents necessarily, but what we do have is a responsibility, and that's not looking at that in a really harsh, critical way. You've got to do this, but as Aliyah said, through a self-compassionate lens, we can do the work. It's our responsibility and only our responsibility, but we can do this work, and it's really deep, life-changing, transformative work if we lean into it. So I think that's a great sort of a quote to hopefully end on for some of the listeners.
Great quote.
So, thanks so much for sharing today, Aliyah. That's been really, really insightful for me, and I'm sure for our listeners. If people want to get in touch with you and do some work with you, what's the best way to get hold of you?
Yes. So I do monthly somatic breath release and inner child healing workshops, which I think you guys have the link for. I do one-to-one somatic trauma therapy sessions where we really work on that kind of the childhood traumas, the attachment wounds, the patterns of behaviors that we want to change, the relationship patterns that we want to come out of. So that's the one-to-one stuff, or the one-to-one coaching. They're the kind of three main ways. And I have my Instagram at Aliyah Coaching. And I think there's another link there to book a 30-minute free consult with me if you want to chat more about this.
Yeah, we'll drop all of that into the show notes, so everyone can contact you. And yeah, thanks everyone for listening as well. Hopefully this evening has been a useful conversation for you. And if it does resonate, please do get in contact with us. We always love hearing from you. Our next conversation will be From Crisis to Connection, Navigating Relationships as a Modern Man, with Puya Delavar, a relationship coach. And so we look forward to seeing you all then. Thanks, Aliyah, and take care, everyone.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.